sister, is Chairman Bobby back from the wedding? I need to speak with him.
What the fuck is there to talk about, pig?
Tyrone, now ain't the time for that shit, man.
If you want it, pick it up.
I can't believe that rat bastard isn't getting the chair. That Newton turd ought to be taken out and shot.
How about a little target practice? Huh? Yeah.
What did you bring up, buddy? What you? Tyrone, listen to me. We gotta move, man. They got a warehouse full of drugs, man.
You just set Bobby shit up to get kidnapped. No. How much did the pigs pay you for that one, Judge?
Drop your piece, motherfucker! Drop it!
You better kill me, Alma. You better kill me right now.
What the hell are you saying?
I'm telling you that the pigs are gonna flood us with dope, man. Bullshit.
Tyrone, hold on. Listen to me. Let's go with Judge and check it out.
This motherfucker is just lying again.
I'm telling you, we gotta take this warehouse down.
All right, we'll go check it out. No fucking around.
They pumped in the dope to neutralize the black community and destroy the Panther power base. But drugs overflowed the borders of the ghetto and ended up on all America's doorstep. Despite ongoing persecution by the authorities, the Panthers continued to provide breakfast programs, sickle cell anemia testing, and even schools for the community. Before they were eventually crushed, the Panthers had chapters in almost every state of the Union and several foreign countries. It came out later that Hoover and the FBI used illegal tactics to destroy the Panthers. Several Panthers are still being held in prison on trumped-up charges. Huey was killed in 1989 in a drug deal. Bobby lives in Pennsylvania. He teaches and lectures. In 1970, there were 300,000 addicts in the United States. Yesterday, there were 3 million. The way I see it, the struggle continues.
The terms slave patrol and militia were interchangeable and synonymous, literally the same exact thing.
With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discord of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood.
Currently, what the communists call their Negro Revolutionary Movement, now masquerading behind the humanitarian banners of civil rights, is contributing tremendous momentum to the communist plans to take over the United States.
You tell them white folks in Mississippi that all the scared niggas are dead. We want black power. We want black power.
About Sacramento, I was like, damn, these brothers are bad. They're here up in Sacramento in the capital, packing.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
So another element that's really crucial and fundamental to understanding how we got to where we are today was while this is all happening, while the FBI and the fully, almost militarized slave patrols are going about destroying the Black Panthers and all forms of leftist organizing and anti-war organizing against Vietnam and all that stuff. While that's happening, while the sort of Republican establishment is rolling out folks like Phyllis Schlafly and beginning this sort of, traditional American values talk, which is very anti-gay, which is very anti-woman's, any semblance of bodily autonomy, and then the very, very beginning stages of the massive irrational fear-mongering and lies over abortion. While all of this soup is building up, there's this whole new, brand new communities that are popping up all over America, which are called the suburbs. A lot of these people coming back from the GI Bill after World War II, but in the 50s and in the 60s, that's when all these suburban communities really solidify, and everyone's got their little matching lawns and their matching cars, and keeping up with the Joneses, who's got the best brand, because they have this new thing too called TV, that all these white people that flooded out to the suburbs because they had the wealth and base wealth and privilege to do so, and access to real type of real jobs and careers that were totally not made available to black and brown people. But as they flood out into the suburbs, and with their brand new cars and their brand new TV sets, they're watching from their little perfectly structured, wonderful America, love God, go to church on Sunday communities. They're watching from there on their TV set what's going on and unfolding in the streets in the civil rights movement. And, what they see as riots and all this stuff, which now that I've seen consistent uprising, like post-George Floyd and stuff like that, I clearly understand because I wasn't alive during the civil rights movement in the 60s, but I have no doubt that the vast majority of the civil rights demonstrations in the 60s, in the quote-unquote civil rights era, were completely nonviolent, completely peaceful, not even property damage and shit going on, no looting going on. But then out come the cops and the National Guard and the dogs and the slave patrols and the hoses and unleash violence on it, and then go on the nightly news that night, and Ted Koppel or whoever, maybe Walter Cronkite, I guess, would get on and be like, the riots. They're rioting again in Harlem. Well, they weren't. They were peacefully marching and then had hoses unloaded on them. But those they see violence and people scattering and all this chaos, and they go, see the black people, if they hadn't have been doing this, we wouldn't be able to show you this image. So it's state violence done against people who have been oppressed since the very beginning of this country, but then they blame them for the violence that the state is committing against them on the street. Meanwhile, all these white people sitting at home just going, oh my gosh, and they just get, something has to be done. Why can't we just get order in America? Why can't the world just look like my perfectly trimmed lawn? If people want to have a lawn trimmed differently like Joe does next door, I'm open to their lawn being slightly different as long as it's kept up and it doesn't look like anything's out of sync or out of order. Let's do that. Let's make the world this way, right? And oh my gosh, I just want to be a Christian. And why can't these, oh my gosh, these insane Marxists that are still creating all this chaos. We just need peace. And oh my gosh, now the blacks, they got guns and they're working around with guns. Meanwhile, the guns was just a flash in the pan for them, and really the bulk of the work they did that really freaked out the mechanisms of power and the slave patrols of the FBI was they were providing services and food and things for poor people, and showing that was possible even if you were poor, and the ways to do it. That scared the shit out of the establishment. But then they use the gun trope and whatever. But all of this is the beginnings of not only just the everything that needed to come in to fall into place for the Reagan era, but it's also the beginnings of a mythology that would live beyond the Reagan era, and that would become the sort of Christo-fascist religious fanaticism of patriots and the militia and the boogaloo and all the stuff that we're seeing today. you have all the base elements coming together, coming to play. One, it's make sure that anyone that stands up for black equality and any type of minimization of black oppression and violence against black people, well, they're Marxists. And Marxists are bad, Marxists are horrible, they murdered everybody, oh my God, Mao Zedong and Stalin and shit, right? And this is all Cold War era. America is seriously in the midst of a Cold War with Russia at this time. So the amount of Cold War propaganda that Americans were subjected to, especially out in those suburbs, is there's no way to properly describe it. We saw remnants of it in the 80s. It started to go away in the 80s, and we'll see how that's relevant. But again, so there's this very, very, very deeply rooted and entrenched infrastructure for fear-mongering against communism and anarchism and Marxism and socialism, right? And attaching the fear of that to anyone fighting for black emancipation or brown emancipation or LGBTQ emancipation or indigenous emancipation, right? And then, you add to that element the religious fervor that's growing behind the anti-abortion movement. All of this comes together with things like the Young Republicans, the Christian Coalition, right? Which we're going to cover extensively in this section of the video. But this is the elements, the foundational elements of what is Morning in America, as Reagan put. And I just want to point out before we get into this, and I'm going to show you all the elements that to really bring together what you'll see. It's sort of the kinder, gentler version of, the Ben Shapiros and the Richard Spencers and the Boogaloo movement of today, and which really, really becomes more weaponized and significant. The militia role becomes much more significant, what we're going to cover in the next section, which is basically the Clinton era, and with Waco and Ruby Ridge and all of those elements and the Aryan nations and stuff, and we're going to get into all that, and the Bundys, and but yeah, it's sort of this, it's sort of like fascism waking up and going, okay, look, this is how we're going to do it. We're going to target the evangelical community. We're going to use abortion as the catalyst with which to do it. And we're also going to continue to make sure that anything that even hints at black emancipation, we're going to attach to the fear-mongering of, Marxists and all this stuff. And in walks Reagan, who's like, we got to end Russia. We got to save capitalism at all costs, and religious freedom's under attack, and I'm pro-life. I'm against abortion. And the right wing in this country loses its fucking mind. They didn't worship Reagan the way that the Trump people worship Trump today, but it was damn near the same. But the last thing I'll say before we really get in, I got kind of an extensive video montage that I put together to illustrate all of what I'm describing. But before we get into that, just want to explain that what you're about to see really reminds me so much of what we see in the last, 4 or 5, maybe 6 years of the targeted efforts focused on campuses in the United States and the movements of the alt-right. It's like these people we're about to cover with Ralph Reed and Jack Abramoff and Grover Norquist and Karl Rove. These were the first people who went out and sort of broke ground that gave way for, that taught the tactics that are being employed by the far-right fascists today. A lot of the very beginning stages of the tactics they use today find their genesis in this movement. And again, also the mythology, which I know these are just talking points, although the Marxists are influencing the blacks against all this stuff to attack our freedoms and to attack Jesus. That's only just the beginning stages. That's like serves well to get a politician elected. But by the time we get to fucking 2020, it's its own beast. It really is its own religion. It literally becomes the far right terrorist death cult we see today. But here, With the Christian Coalition, Ralph Reed et al., we see the beginnings of that horrible, terrifying mythology.
Thank you. Ralph?
Mr. President, I think it goes without saying that in a moment like this, we all come together as Americans. We all bow to Almighty God. We ask for His grace and His mercy over those who are affected. And we thank you, the Vice President, and your entire team, FEMA, everything you're doing to deploy every resource of government to help those who've been affected. And most of all, Mr. President, we thank you for acknowledging that ultimately it is God who is the source of our unity as Americans, and I thank you for issuing this proclamation. Thank you.
Judaism and its eternal values have little in common with modern American liberalism.
Jack found a way to marry religion and politics by becoming an orthodox conservative. In business, politics, and national defense, he felt the law of the jungle should prevail, beliefs he brought to the college Republicans.
If you look around Washington, D.C. today, and you look at college Republicans 20 years ago, when we were all active, Grover Norquist and Ralph Reed and Karl Rove before us, you look around who is running the town and who's making policy and who are inhabiting the congressional offices and the White House and the rest, they're former college Republicans.
You can't get a 35-year-old to teach the Republican Party how to get to young people. You just can't rely upon it. Young people have got to reach other young people, and that's what we're seeking to do. First of all, voter registration is probably the most important function that we are undertaking now.
And this is a generation who came onto campus in the 1970s rebelling against the 60s, the whole ethos of the 60s.
We are hoping that Mr. Nixon, through his past, we've seen that he's at least more anti-communist than the last administration.
I was a young American for freedom. We were always working in coordination with the college Republicans, but they weren't ideologically conservative enough for us until Jack Abramoff got involved. Then they became ideologically conservative.
And it's A-B-R-A-M-O-F-F?
Right.
Okay. Chairman, College Republican National Committee. Okay.
Abramoff is a little older than I am, but I was a college Republican in the early 80s, and in a lot of ways when the college Republicans took that sharp turn to the right, that's the same direction I was going in. A lot of the same heroes. I thought Ronald Reagan was like the greatest man who ever lived.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
The 80 Reagan campaign was to conservative young people what the 72 McGovern campaign was to young people on the left.
Mike Waller was a foot soldier in Ronald Reagan's growing army of college Republicans. Traveling to Nicaragua to support the Contras, Waller saw himself as part of Reagan's crusade to combat Soviet communism.
We had kids doing things on 800 campuses, and they'd have guest speakers go out there. He made it really exciting to be a college-age student and to be a Republican.
We are bringing, via these students, information to other students on campus so they'll understand what's going on around them.
He had an excellent way with words. He had energy. He had confidence. He could play well to the camera. And I think more importantly, he would elevate others who could do the same, like Ralph Reed.
A political zealot from the University of Georgia, Ralph Reed had no interest in the politics of compromise. I do guerrilla warfare, he said. I paint my face and travel at night. You don't know it's over till you're in a body bag.
At the college Republican headquarters, the favorite movie was Patton. They loved that war general's rhetoric. They'd pump up their field organizers by forcing them to memorize George C. Scott's key speech in the movie, but they would substitute Democrat for Nazis.
The Nazis?
The Democrats are the enemy.
Are the enemy. Wade
into them.
Spill their blood.
Spill their blood.
Shoot them in the belly.
Shoot them in the belly. So that's the kind of rhetoric that they would use to get all of their young volunteers all fired up and ready to go. The membership skyrocketed. They got in the news. They organized protests.
Good morning. My name is Ralph Reed. I'm the Executive Director of Students for America.
They like to be these sort of faux soldiers of fortune. Yes, they would wear fatigues and think Indiana Jones. That's what these guys thought they were.
Along the lines of those that are in Nicaragua and have been in Nicaragua since the Sandinista communist overthrow in that country.
They were very good at street theater. So they would, for example, they would burn figures in effigy.
Build a mock Berlin Wall. And then every year we would come out with members of Congress with sledgehammers and smash the Berlin Wall to smithereens.
And everybody said, well, who are those crazy kids?
They weren't conservatives in the traditional sense of the word. They were radicals. They were campus, revolutionaries. They were overthrowing the old order. And the old order was liberalism.
Jack Abramoff gets elected president of the College Republicans, and his lieutenant is Grover Norquist. Grover Norquist is a Harvard MBA who believes that government is sort of an evil necessity. He understood and studied the Russian Revolution and drew lessons from it.
He viewed himself as a right-wing libertarian Leninist, was anti-Soviet, obviously, but he wanted to take Leninist political methodology and use it for a Republican or libertarian cause.
Grover Norquist very much saw the world in black and white. There's the good guys and the bad guys.
We didn't know at the time. We thought he was just some sort of paranoid person. He was pretty secretive then, very conspiratorial. He kept files on his friends. He kept files on everybody.
All these guys, they love to read spy novels. And the book that opened my eyes was The Spike. That was one where I got it. It was that stupid fucking spy novel. Okay, so the Soviets are pulling the strings, manipulating American domestic politics and manipulating our foreign policy. And the way that they're doing it, it's a think tank. And this was widely believed on the right, that that's how the Soviets were giving their marching orders to their American dupes.
I served them. I fought for them. I'm on the point of winning for them the greatest foothold they will ever have in this country.
And that was the kind of anti-communism that these guys bought into, this kind of, I guess the correct word for it is paranoid.
Many people are frightened of you. And there's the quote.
Do I look scary to you?
You don't look scary. You look like you're about 18.
Ralph Reed is a man who lives on the edge and always has. He was always kind of pushing the boundaries. He himself says he was drinking heavily, he was smoking, and then he found Jesus.
When I see you, I'm drawn to you.
Reed discovered that the wages of sin were not nearly as lucrative as God's were.
Here comes temptation, tempting.
In the years following his conversion, Reed's faith-based businesses grossed over $100 million for delivering religious conservatives to political campaigns.
We will be the most powerful political force in American politics. The first is a grassroots strategy.
He started his career with the Christian Coalition, founded by TV evangelist Pat Robertson, to campaign against unmarried sex, gambling, and abortion. Under Ralph Reed, the Christian Coalition became a political powerhouse.
Are you glad to be in Washington?
Because this Congress didn't vote to increase taxes.
Grover Norquist had also risen to the top of the Republican establishment by becoming an anti-tax radical.
I don't want to abolish government. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I could drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub. I don't want to abolish government. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I could drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub.
Now, on the heels of the Reagan and Bush era and the wars in Iraq and all this stuff, and on the right wing, they're in religious, everything is wonderful. The suburbs are growing. The white people are getting fabulously wealth on this massive bubble that ends up bursting later, as capitalism does cyclically, which we're not going to get into the economic stuff too much in this video at all. But definitely in the 80s is very, very prosperous for the white suburban community. Okay? And they're just adoring Reagan and Bush. And, it truly is morning in America, and the future is so bright. until Clinton comes along. The Clinton era comes along, and then boom, fuck the government, anti-fucking federal militias lose their mind and go into full force. But also at the same time, let's be clear, Clinton puts in place that crime bill, which ends up leading to the mass incarceration we see today, which is a massive extension of the convict leasing concepts. It's convict leasing 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, right? But there's also what had happened in the 80s with the ground. There was a massive, I should back up just a little bit, but there was a massive upswell of Nazis in America. But they called themselves skinheads, but they weren't, because you can't be a Nazi and be a skinhead. Skinhead culture was birthed out of the unity between working class white British youth and working class Jamaican immigrant youth in England, and that's the birth of skinhead. It's blacks and white working class people. It's a working class culture of unity between blacks and whites that was co-opted later by Nazis. So we call them boneheads. But a lot of people may remember there was a huge groundswell of Nazis, which, look, man, when you have someone, a demagoguing figure like Reagan, who represents the glorious religious maintaining of the white supremacist status quo of America, it emboldens the most racist people in America. And we saw a huge rise of violence by very open and proud neo-Nazi people who committed all kinds of murder and terror and violence. And the federal government really actually did crack down on them in a lot of ways, and they sort of recessed back to into their compounds, like in Ohio and the Aryan Nations compounds and stuff like that, and really inhabited much of the militia community, right? Because now the militias, that they don't understand that was actually the word for slave patrol. They think that they're these people that if they run around in the forest with their guns and their camo, that they'll protect America from the scourge of the Russians and the Marxists that are coming to get them. Okay, all of that is really beginning to solidify, and its infrastructure is really becoming solidified as we get into the Clinton era. But what happens when Clinton comes in too is all those people have been celebrating with religious ferocity the gloriousness of American greatness under Reagan and Bush, go into holy shit, we have to fucking wreck everything and protect ourselves from the scourge and tyranny of the devil Marxists of the fucking Clinton administration. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next section. But first, check out this video and we'll be right back.
I don't want to abolish government. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I could drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub.
Christian Coalition Executive Director Ralph Reed.
We felt that with the roughly 1,900,000 households that Pat Robertson came out of his presidential campaign with on computer tape, about 175,000 of those identified as activists and prime donors, that there was a built-in base to build a new pro-family Christian organization in this country. The question is how we accomplish it, and that's where we get to this five-fold strategy. It's a five-fold strategy that if we execute this in the coming 10 years, we will be the most powerful political force in American politics. The first is a grassroots strategy. We're going to have the nation divided up into seven state regions. And in each of those regions, we're going to have a full-time, paid, trained, professional regional director. They will be responsible for training activists in their region, interfacing with candidates at the local, state, and federal level, and mobilizing people at the grassroots. Each of those regional directors in each of those 7 states will have 10 top counties, targets, where they have to organize down into the precincts by the next election.
Get the foot on the neck and go for the kill. Yes, we good Christians, we can do that too. When you get your opponent, when you start getting one more crack, one more weakness, you do not let up. At that point, you go for the jugular.
What is the Christian Coalition? Is it a religious or a political organization? Well, it's a public issues organization, organized under
that wasn't one of the choices I gave.
Oh, you didn't get Republican. Well, it's a crossover. It does political things from a religious point of view.
The purpose of creationism is to destroy the possibility of dispassionate, honest, intellectual, and scientific inquiry. It is to make facts interchangeable with opinion. It is to make lies true. And that is a dangerous precedent to set, because then you are allowed to view the world and the reality around you through this distorted ideological prism. That's what's being done. It's a war against truth. It's a war against real intellectual inquiry. It's a war against science. And that, of course, is a fundamental component to the fascist state or the totalitarian state. In order for these movements to take power, they need a prolonged period of instability or crisis. And remember that there are tens of millions of people in the United States who've been completely disenfranchised with the flight of manufacturing jobs and have fallen into a level of despair. And these people, in their despair and their rage, have turned to a world where they're offered magic and angels and Jesus will walk with them, and they've been ripe for manipulation by these demagogues.
I mean, you don't see anything wrong with, for example, picketing the funeral of an AIDS victim?
Best time in the world to picket those preachers. That's when they're paying close attention to you. That's dying time is truth time. They've been living lives based on lies. They died deaths based on lies. It's cruelty to stand around their dead bodies and preach more lies.
Good morning, I'm Dara Brown. There's breaking news at this hour from Orlando, where there are reports of a shooting at a nightclub in that city.
Every sodomite's a pedophile. Every single one, it's an unnatural sin. It's unnatural to want to be with someone of the same sex. Today, people say, well, aren't you sad that 50 sodomites died? Here's the problem with that. It's like the equivalent of asking me, what if you asked me, hey, are you sad that 50 pedophiles were killed today? No, I think that's great.
The good news is that there's 50 less pedophiles in this world because, these homosexuals are a bunch of disgusting perverts and pedophiles. That's who was a victim here, are a bunch of just disgusting homosexuals at a gay bar, okay?
His cousin said Ron came out to his family just this year. He was afraid they might not accept him, but they did. They embraced his boyfriend as well. He was 22. Christopher Andrew Lee, known as Drew. He was Ron's boyfriend, and his mom says he established the Gay-Straight Alliance at his high school. He was 32 years old.
I think Orlando, Florida is a little safer tonight. Now that 50, the tragedy is that more of them didn't die. I mean, the tragedy is I'm kind of upset that he didn't finish the job.
I begin the book with a short list written by the writer Umberto Eco, where he lists what he thinks are the 14 points of eternal fascism or fascism, that cult of masculinity, that war against modernism, that war against truth, that obsession with apocalyptic violence as a purging agent or cleansing agent, to make the world pure and usher in the utopia. And I think when you look closely at the ideology of the radical Christian right, those so-called Christians in the United States who want to create a Christian state, in generic terms, they're fascist. Certainly fascism conjures up historical images, as you saw, pictures of Mussolini or Hitler, but it is an ideological belief system. And that's certainly the argument of the book, that this has been a dangerous mutation. These are not traditional evangelicals. They're not traditional fundamentalists who have always called on followers to remove themselves from the contaminants of secular society, to shun political power. Evangelical leaders like Billy Graham always talked about not getting too close to power, and he himself was used and burned by Richard Nixon. This is a dangerous and radical mutation. It is about creating, using the iconography and language of Christianity to create an authoritarian, or I think arguably a fascist state.
Sacramento, I was like, damn, these brothers are bad. They're here up in Sacramento in the capital, packing.